Hello and welcome back to Skepticus. This is your boy, Adam of Nola, and I have something a little different for you today. It's a little off the cuff, no script, no notes, just a little thought that's been burrowing into the back of my brain here. Up until this point in the very young history of my channel, Skepticus, I've been largely going over Old Testament stuff. It's not that I don't care about the New Testament. It's just that with my God of Free Bible study, I'm spending a lot of time starting from Genesis and going all the way forward. And there's just so much other effery to address in the Old Testament that I could be doing that for a long time. But I understand that for a lot of Christians today, it doesn't matter what you show them in the Old Testament. A lot of them just don't care. Even if I could show you a verse in the Old Testament that word for word said, Yahweh is dead, Jesus was nobody, your religion is stupid, Christians wouldn't care because they would say, oh, that's the Old Testament. None of that matters. All that matters is the New Testament. And to be fair, when I was a Christian, I was one of these people most of the time. I was aware of the Old Testament. I had read the Old Testament many years ago. And like too many Christians, I had skimmed over a lot of it. But when you go to church on Sunday, they're almost always preaching from the New Testament. And almost all people care about are the teachings of Jesus himself or Paul or Peter. So it's easy just to shove everything from the Old Testament aside and say, none of that matters. That's the Old Testament. But that's fine. I got to thinking today about the words of Jesus. So hang with me just a second. I want you to follow the thread that I'm trying to pull on here. And hopefully, even if you don't agree with me, at least you can kind of see the point I'm making. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were written, depending upon your sources, somewhere between 66 CE and 110 CE. John was the last one that we know was written. Mark, even though Mark doesn't come first in the New Testament, Mark is generally considered to be the earliest of the Gospels. And the earliest estimate that I've ever seen for the formal writing of Mark is 66 CE. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that people hadn't written versions of it somewhere, that they weren't maybe passing along their own notes that went from one church to the other in the old Mediterranean. But the first time that we know of someone formally sitting down and writing out any of the Gospels, which, as far as we understand, was Mark, that was at the earliest 66 CE. Most of the estimates I've seen are like 70 plus, but I'm going to, for the sake of argument, take the earliest estimate that I've been able to find, which again is 66 CE. I bring this up because Jesus is believed to have died either on 30 CE or 33 CE. The exact year of his death is up to some debate. We may never know exactly, but let's just take the latest estimate, which would be 33 CE, meaning that if we take the earliest estimate for the first writing of the first gospel, which was the first one written was Mark, and we take the timeline backwards from then to the death of Christ, you have 33 years. I'm also going to, for the sake of this video, just give all you Christians the benefit of the doubt and say that Mark was written by Mark. There's really no reason to believe that at all, but I don't even want to get into that discussion right now. So we're just going to assume that Mark was written by Mark, and Matthew was written by Matthew, and Luke by Luke, and John by John. We're just going to give you that one today, okay? So Mark wrote the first copy of the Gospel of Mark, or at least dictated it to someone who wrote it down in 66 CE, which, as I've just said, is at the earliest 33 years after the death of Jesus. Why do I belabor all these details of timeline? Well, it got me to thinking earlier today about the actual words, the quotations, the dialogue that we supposedly have from Jesus Christ himself written down in the four Gospels. I did a wee bit of Googling today, and I found a cool site that had all of the direct quotes from Jesus laid out in a single document. And I'm going to be putting screenshots of that document behind me here on the green screen so that you can see them as I'm talking about this. It's not important that you read through the exact quotes. I'm sure you've read your Bible, you good Christians, you. I'm sure you know all these quotes. The point here is not to go through the specific quotes. The point here is to talk about the sheer volume that we have of quotes supposedly directly from Jesus. This document that I'm highlighting here has all of them from all four of the Gospels put in one document. They were very cool, like they tried to color code them in terms of which gospel they came from. There's no double counting. So in those cases where a given quote appears in 2 or 3 or even in all 4 gospels, it's only counted once. So we're not taking one quote and counting it 3 or 4 times. Also, for what it's worth, they even tried to put them in chronological order, and I'm not sure exactly how they do that. I mean, they say in the notes that it's kind of hit or miss because it's not like we have exact dates and times on everything that happens in the Gospels, but it's interesting that they tried to do that, and I can appreciate their attempt. But as we go through this document, there's page after page after page after page of quotes supposedly directly from Jesus. Now, for the 40 years that I was a Christian, these were, for my money, the most important parts of the whole Bible. They definitely played into that whole red letter Christian idea. This idea that you had these quotes from Jesus. And even though I was never a student back then of translations and different authors and competing interpretations, I still figured that the best way to get to the real teachings of Jesus Christ and ultimately the religion itself was to look at the true words from the man, God, man, something like that, Jesus Christ himself. There was something that felt pure about that. Even if you had questions about all the things that Paul supposedly wrote, and even if you really were uncomfortable with all that gross stuff in the Old Testament, if you just went through and read all these great quotes from Jesus, there was so much to be gleaned from this, right? And I'm not saying that there's not now. Even as an atheist, you can garner a lot of wisdom just by looking at the quotes of Jesus. But there's a problem here. Again, the earliest gospel that we have was written 33 years, at least, after the death of Jesus. Maybe that doesn't seem that remarkable to you. So let me give you an analogy. 33 years ago, I was 19. I can remember things that I did when I was 19. I can remember friends that I was with. I could pull up some crazy stories about what young, stupid Adam did when he was 19. And what my young, stupid friends did when we were all out being young and stupid together. I could even pull up some stories about what my friend said and what I said in reply and what they said in reply to me. But after 33 years, how accurate do you think that most of the quotes I give you from this event that happened more than 3 decades ago would be? Now, it'd be one thing if I just said, well, we wanted to go do this thing, and I asked Joe, and Joe said, okay. That seems pretty simple, right? But what if I don't tell you that Joe said, okay? What if I give you a paragraph that Joe supposedly told me 33 years ago? How accurate do you think that paragraph would be? And maybe this paragraph in which I'm quoting Joe is central to the story. So maybe I got that one paragraph right. But then if I wanted to give you page after page after page after even more pages of all the things that Joe supposedly said to me 33 years ago, how accurate do you believe that all of that dialogue would be? Now keep in mind, this 33-year rubric is the shortest time frame that we can posit from the death of Christ to the publication of the first gospel, the Gospel of Mark. The last gospel, John, seems to have been written somewhere from 90 to 110 CE. Most estimates seem to say somewhere around 100 CE, meaning that that gospel would have been published 67 years after the events that it is recounting. Of course, John's gospel has no lack of quotes in it from Jesus. It's just as quote-rich as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But whoever wrote John, and again, we'll just say for the sake of argument that it was John, when he wrote it, he was writing things that happened 60 plus years ago. Most of you watching this video aren't even 60 plus years old. And if you are, no disrespect, but I'm not sure how much exact dialogue you can pull back from stuff that happened 60 plus years ago. This really struck me because I started thinking about all the accounts of Jesus, the miracles, the travels, the sermons. Most of these things would be fairly memorable to me as events. I can imagine Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the authors of the Gospels, actually giving us decent information about these events, because even if they happened decades prior, they would be memorable. But it's one thing to account an event that happened 60, 50, or even 30 years ago. It's another thing to recount in great detail all of the exact dialogue that happened between you and your buddies during that event. Let me give you this example. Let's imagine that you were one of the people who stormed the beaches at Normandy. I would imagine that if you stormed the beaches at Normandy, you would probably remember some key gut-wrenching events from that day until your last day on this earth. You could probably explain in some excruciating detail what it was like to first step on that beach with bullets whizzing by you and mortars going off. You could probably go into great detail describing the chaos, the fear, the sight of dead bodies. That stuff, I imagine, never leaves you. You could probably even tell me some commands that your first sergeant gave you, or some things that were screamed by a buddy who was looking for support on the beach, or even worse, maybe some things that were screamed by people that were hit or dying. But could you actually tell me in great detail, long paragraphs of everything that was said between you and your buddies before you hit the beach, or after you had finally stormed the beach and you were regrouping? How much of that dialogue is it actually reasonable to believe that you could recall decades later? If there was a Son of God, if he was as charismatic as the books say, if he was horrifically crucified and resurrected, I'm sure that would have left quite a mark on you. I'm sure you could have been able to recount large pieces of it decades later. Even then, how much of that dialogue directly from Christ, word for word, would you be able to write down with great fidelity all those years afterward? This isn't a knock on anyone's memory. If you stop this video right now and tried to recount the exact sentences that I said 5 minutes ago, your recollection of it would be incredibly spotty at best. You would, no doubt, be able to bring up certain key points that I've discussed. You may even remember certain sentences that I've said, but you couldn't spit back my dialogue, even from this video that you've watched only minutes before. Human memory doesn't work that way. And yet, we are to believe that for the four Gospels, which were written starting from about 33 years after Jesus' death and going up through about 70 years after his death, we're supposed to believe that they contained a great amount of detailed dialogue from Jesus Christ himself. Keeping in mind that as far as we've ever heard, Jesus never wrote down a word. So all of this dialogue from Jesus that got written down decades later had to be from someone else's recollection, if it really even was someone's recollection. Or was it part of the tale? Part of the tales that had been passed from one early version of the church to another, from one gathering to another, as they shaped and reworked the legacy and the legend of Jesus Christ. Now, to be perfectly clear, I was a Christian for 40 years, and I know that I've said nothing here that is going to shake the confidence of any believer, and that's okay. I'm not trying to disavow you of your sacred ideas of the Gospels. I know that I'm not going to. But for anyone who wants to be reasonable about it, there's a lot of questions involved, and not just authorship, not just timelines. But after all those years, even if we wanted to assume that the Gospels are totally accurate, how do you honestly expect people to have all of these lengthy quotes from Jesus decades after he died and was resurrected? And I know what the standard apologetic answer is. It's divinely inspired. This is all God working through people. But if it's God working through people, if this is truly divinely inspired, then why did it take 33 years after the death of his own son before the first copy of the first gospel got written down? If you were the omnipotent God, all-powerful, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, omnipresent, and you had actually allowed your son to be crucified to save mankind, would you then wait 33 years before you got on some guy's ass and said, hey, dude, write this stuff down? Does that make sense? For that matter, does it make sense that the omnipotent God of the universe actually needs people to get off their ass and write this stuff down for him? I'm not trying to be a smartass here. When it came to the stone tablets on Sinai, supposedly God used his finger and wrote them himself. Now, why Moses had to climb the mountain to get them, I'm not sure. That's another discussion, because you think that God just could have had the stone tablets come floating down the mountain, but whatever. He works in mysterious ways. But you want me to believe that there's no problem in the recollection of all these direct quotes from Jesus, even though they were written down decades after his death. And you want me to believe that's not a problem because of divine inspiration. But divine inspiration apparently took 33 years before the first gospel could even make pen on paper. It doesn't feel very divine. It feels damn human to me. I'm just going to close with this final thought. If you told me about something fantastic that happened around you 33 years ago, I'd listen. I may even believe you. But if this tale of something that happened 33 years ago was then accompanied by a huge amount of dialogue that you were attributing to one of the key players in this drama that wasn't you, I'd start wondering just how accurate your account really could have been. You could tell me about a world record that was broken 33 years ago. You can tell me about an amazing sports outcome from 33 years ago. But if you want to tell me paragraph after paragraph of exactly what people said at that event 33 years ago, and you want to tell it to me all from memory, I'm going to be a little skeptical. And I think that all of you should be skeptical too. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope to see you on future videos. But until I do, lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.